In the dim underground parking lot beneath the San Francisco financial district, CEO Elena Hartwell's world shattered in the space of a single heartbeat. She had just ended a conference call about the quarterly earnings report when she turned to find her daughter Sophie gone. The black Mercedes sedan sat exactly where she'd parked it 3 minutes earlier, but the 6-year-old who had been standing right beside her had vanished. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her phone slipping from perfectly manicured fingers to clatter against concrete. Then she saw him. A man in a faded gray uniform was sprinting toward the shadows at the far end of the garage, and in his arms was Sophie's small body, pink jacket unmistakable, even in the yellowish fluorescent haze. The stuffed rabbit clover dangled from the man's grip, its white fur catching the light. Elena's scream tore from somewhere primal, a sound she had never heard herself make. Her legs moved before conscious thought could catch up, high heels striking the ground in sharp staccato bursts as she ran after them. The man was fast, faster than anyone his size should be, and he was carrying her child into the darkness, where the overhead lights had burned out weeks ago and maintenance had never bothered to replace them. Sophie's cry pierced the air, thin and terrified, and Elena felt her heart attempting to pound its way out of her ribcage. She fumbled for her phone, realized she'd dropped it, kept running anyway. The man rounded a concrete support pillar and disappeared. Elena's mind screamed the single word that every parent fears above all else: kidnapper. This was happening. This was actually happening. Her daughter was being stolen right in front of her, and she was too slow, too far away, too utterly powerless to stop it. Then came the sound that would replay in her nightmares for months to come. Metal shrieking against concrete, the deep mechanical groan of something massive and wrong, followed by the explosive crash of an impact that shook the floor beneath her feet. Elena stumbled, caught herself against a pillar, and stared in horror at the twisted wreckage of a delivery truck that had somehow appeared from the upper ramp and slammed into a row of parking cars exactly where Sophie had been standing 30 seconds earlier. Glass and twisted metal littered the ground. The truck's front end was completely crushed, steam hissing from the ruptured radiator. If Sophie had still been there, if the man hadn't grabbed her, if those extra seconds hadn't passed, the thought wouldn't complete itself. Elena's brain simply refused to process the alternative. Security guards were running now, their flashlight beams cutting through the dusty air. One of them was shouting into his radio. Elena forced her legs to move again, stumbling toward the shadows where the man had taken her daughter. She found them behind the pillar. The man was crouched low, his body curled protectively around Sophie, and he was speaking to her in a voice too quiet for Elena to hear. Sophie was crying, but she wasn't struggling. The man looked up as Elena approached, and even in the poor light she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He was older than she'd first thought, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and a shadow of stubble across his jaw. His uniform identified him as maintenance staff, the kind of person Elena would normally walk past without seeing. She didn't walk past now. She lunged forward and ripped Sophie from his arms, pulling her daughter tight against her chest. The man didn't resist. He simply stood, raised his hands slightly as if to show he meant no harm, and took a step back. Elena found herself shouting at him, words tumbling out in an incoherent rush of rage and terror and confusion. "What did you think you were doing? How dare you touch my daughter? I'm calling the police. You're going to jail. Do you understand what you've done?" The security guard reached them, breathing hard, one hand on his radio and the other on the grip of his holstered weapon. He positioned himself between Elena and the man, barking questions that the man answered in a flat, emotionless tone that made Elena want to scream even louder. Yes, that was him. No, he hadn't intended to harm the child. He had seen the truck. He had acted on instinct. That was all. The guard's partner arrived, slightly winded, and reported that he'd checked the surveillance footage from the entrance cameras. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold Sophie, who had stopped crying and was now clinging to her mother's neck with a grip that hurt. The second guard pulled out a tablet and called up the video file, rewinding to show the past 5 minutes. Elena watched over his shoulder, Sophie still pressed against her, and felt the world tilt sideways. The footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed Sophie crouching behind the Mercedes to pick up Clover, who had fallen from her small hands. It showed Elena 20 feet away, phone pressed to her ear, completely oblivious. It showed the delivery truck appearing at the top of the entrance ramp, rolling slowly at first and then gathering speed as it descended. And it showed the man in the maintenance uniform dropping his cleaning equipment and sprinting across 40 feet of concrete in just under 4 seconds, scooping Sophie into his arms and diving behind the support pillar exactly zero point 0.8 seconds before the truck plowed through the space where the little girl had been kneeling. The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Elena stared at the screen, watching the truck's impact over and over as the guard replayed the footage. She looked at the wreckage, metal twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist. She looked at her daughter, alive and breathing and whole in her arms. Then she looked at the man who had saved Sophie's life, and the words that came out of her mouth were so inadequate they felt obscene. "I'm so sorry. I thought you were attacking her. I didn't see what was happening. Thank you. Oh God, thank you for saving my daughter." The man nodded once, a curt acknowledgement that carried no warmth. He gently unwrapped Sophie's small fingers from where they had reached out to clutch at his sleeve, his movements careful and deliberate. He told the security guards he needed to get home to his son, his voice still flat and distant. They released him without further question. He walked toward the exit without looking back, his gait slightly uneven as though something in his back or hip pained him. Elena watched him go and felt an unfamiliar sensation crawling up her spine, something she hadn't experienced in the 3 years since her divorce had finalized and taught her that trusting anyone was the fastest path to devastation. The feeling was shame, hot and uncomfortable, mixed with a gratitude so overwhelming it nearly brought her to her knees. The head of security arrived, a barrel-chested man named Morrison who had worked in the building for 2 decades. He examined the truck with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many accidents to take anything at face value. After 5 minutes, he called Elena and the guards over to the driver's side. The door hung open, revealing an empty cab. Morrison pointed to the handbrake mechanism, then pulled a small flashlight from his belt and directed the beam at the exposed metal. The bolts had been loosened, not completely removed, which would have been obvious, but carefully adjusted so that the brake would hold initially and then slip free after a few minutes of sitting on an incline. Someone had used professional tools to do this, probably a socket wrench set, and they had calculated the timing precisely. The truck had been parked on the 3rd-level ramp at exactly the angle needed to send it rolling down toward the spot where Elena typically parked her car. Morrison's expression was grim as he explained this. The word he used was sabotage. Elena felt Sophie's weight in her arms and thought she might be sick. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had deliberately engineered a 2-ton vehicle to roll down a ramp at the exact time she would be collecting her daughter. Someone had tried to kill them. The guards were calling the police, their voices urgent now, and Morrison was already on his phone demanding the security footage from the past week. Elena stood in the wreckage and destruction, holding Sophie close enough that the child squirmed in discomfort, and tried to understand how her carefully controlled world had just transformed into something unrecognizable. Detective Sarah Chen arrived 40 minutes later, a compact woman in her early 40s with graying hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She spent 20 minutes examining the truck, another 10 reviewing the footage, and then pulled Elena aside for questioning while a uniformed officer stayed with Sophie. The questions came rapid fire, delivered in a tone that was professional but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Did Ms. Hartwell have any enemies? Business rivals? Disgruntled employees? Anyone who had threatened her recently? Ex-husband, perhaps? Elena found herself rattling off names without really thinking about them. Derek Ashford from DataMed Solutions, who had lost a $400 million contract to Hartwell MedTech last year, and whose company had nearly gone under as a result. Victor Kane at BioCorp, who had attempted a hostile takeover 6 months ago and failed spectacularly. Angela Torres at Metasecure, who had accused Elena of stealing proprietary technology and then backed down when Elena's legal team had buried her in discovery requests. 2 former employees who had filed wrongful termination suits, both of which had been settled quietly. Her ex-husband Richard, who had embezzled $2 million from the company and was currently serving a 3-year sentence at San Quentin. Chen wrote everything down in a small notebook, her pen moving with practiced efficiency. When Elena finished, the detective looked up and asked the question that cut straight through to the heart of the matter. All of those people might have reason to harm Ms. Hartwell's business interest or reputation, but which of them would actually try to murder her child? Which of them hated her enough to cross that particular line? Elena opened her mouth to answer and found she had no words. She didn't know. She had spent a decade building Hartwell MedTech from a mid-sized pharmaceutical company into a billion-dollar medical technology conglomerate. She had made enemies, certainly, people who resented her success or felt she had taken something from them. But targeting Sophie, her 6-year-old daughter who had never hurt anyone in her entire life, that implied a level of malice she couldn't comprehend. Chen recommended private security, professional bodyguards, someone with tactical training and experience. She handed Elena a business card for a firm that specialized in executive protection, then added that the police would increase patrols around Elena's home and office, but their resources were limited. The best defense was to make it harder for whoever had done this to get another opportunity. Elena took the card with numb fingers and promised she would make calls in the morning. The detective and uniformed officers left. Morrison promised to review every frame of security footage personally and send Elena a full report. The tow truck arrived to remove what was left of the delivery vehicle. Slowly, the parking garage returned to its usual state of fluorescent-lit emptiness, though the scattered glass and twisted metal remained as evidence that something terrible had almost happened. Elena carried Sophie to the Mercedes and buckled her into the car seat with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Sophie had gone quiet, her small face pale, Clover clutched so tightly that the stuffed rabbit's fabric was beginning to tear at the seams. Elena drove home on autopilot, navigating the evening traffic through downtown San Francisco without conscious thought. Her mind kept replaying the footage, the truck rolling down the ramp, Sophie crouching to pick up her toy, the man in the maintenance uniform running faster than should have been humanly possible. If he hadn't been there, if he had been 30 seconds slower, if he had hesitated even briefly. The thought spiraled into darkness and Elena forced it away. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not when someone was out there planning another attempt. Because Chen was right, whoever had sabotaged that truck wouldn't stop after one failure. They had invested time and planning into this attack. They would try again, and next time Elena might not have a guardian angel in a faded uniform appearing out of nowhere to save her daughter's life. She put Sophie to bed in the master bedroom rather than the child's own room, needing her daughter close. Sophie fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from fear and adrenaline crash. Elena sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe for a long time, counting each inhale and exhale as though she could keep Sophie alive through sheer force of will. When she was certain the child was deeply asleep, Elena finally allowed herself to move to her home office. The room was exactly as she had left it that morning, all clean lines and minimalist furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the Bay Bridge lit up against the night sky. Elena's laptop sat on the desk where she had abandoned it 8 hours earlier. She opened it now and pulled up Google, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a long moment before she typed the words into the search bar. Marcus Rivera, Rescue Specialist, San Francisco. The results came back immediately. The first hit was a news article from 2018, the headline reading, "Local Hero Leads Successful Bridge Collapse Rescue." Elena clicked through and found herself staring at a photograph of a younger version of the man who had saved Sophie. He was in uniform in the photo, the gear identifying him as part of the technical rescue unit attached to the San Francisco Fire Department. He was smiling, standing with his arm around a woman with dark hair and warm eyes. The article described how Marcus Rivera had led his team through a partial bridge collapse following a minor earthquake, coordinating the safe extraction of 7 people trapped in vehicles. One quote jumped out. Rivera has an almost supernatural ability to sense structural instabilities before they become critical. His team calls him human radar because he can hear things others miss, the groan of failing metal, the shift of compromised concrete. In emergency response, that skill is the difference between life and death. Elena read the article twice, then clicked to the next search result. This one was a brief notice from 2D21. Technical rescue specialist Marcus Rivera has left the San Francisco Fire Department under personal circumstances. The department wishes him well in his future endeavors. No additional details were provided. His LinkedIn profile was sparse, listing only current employment as facilities maintenance at Cornerstone Building Services, The company contracted to clean and maintain the parking structure where Elena parked daily. No social media presence. No photographs after 2021. It was as though the man in the rescue uniform had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a janitor who kept his head down and his past buried. But Elena had seen him move today. She had watched the footage enough times to understand that the speed and precision he had displayed weren't the actions of a former rescue specialist who had let his skills atrophy. He had calculated trajectory, assessed danger, and executed a perfect extraction in under 5 seconds, all without apparent conscious thought. That kind of capability didn't fade. It was muscle memory so deeply ingrained it became instinct. She needed him. The realization came with absolute clarity, cutting through the fog of shock and exhaustion that had clouded her thinking since the attack. Chen had recommended professional security, people trained in executive protection. But those people would be strangers, employees doing a job for money. They wouldn't have the kind of tactical awareness that made the difference between reacting to danger and preventing it in the first place. Marcus Rivera had proven he could do both. Elena pulled up the contact information for Cornerstone Building Services and found the emergency after-hours number. She hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 11 at night. But she had a phone number now, pulled from the company's employee directory with a few keystrokes, and her daughter's life was worth more than social niceties about appropriate calling times. She picked up her phone and composed a text message, keeping it simple and direct. "This is Elena Hartwell. I need to speak with you. Please." She sent it before she could second-guess the decision. The message showed as delivered but not read. Elena set the phone down and returned to her laptop, pulling up the security protocols for her home and office. The systems were state-of-the-art, installed 2 years ago when the first threats had started coming in from business rivals. Cameras, motion sensors, reinforced doors, panic buttons in every room. It should have been enough. But someone had gotten past the parking garage security to sabotage a truck with professional precision, and Elena found herself questioning every assumption she had made about her own safety. The phone buzzed. Elena grabbed it with enough force that she nearly knocked it off the desk. The message was short. "Tomorrow, noon, Main Street Coffee on 3rd. The response came from a number with a 415 area code, no name attached. Elena stared at it for a moment, then typed back a single word. Yes, she didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside her bed and watched Sophie breathe, occasionally getting up to check the locks on every door and window in the house. At 3 in the morning, she made herself a pot of coffee and returned to her office, pulling up every file she had on business competitors and former employees. There had to be something she was missing, some connection or grudge that would explain why someone hated her enough to target her child. But the spreadsheets and legal documents all blurred together after an hour of reading, and Elena found herself staring out the window at the pre-dawn darkness, thinking about the man who had saved Sophie's life, and wondering what kind of personal circumstances would make someone walk away from being a hero. The answer came to her as the sun rose over the bay, painting the water in shades of gold and pink that reminded her of the morning Sophie was born. She had been so young then, only 28, newly married and convinced that success and family could coexist if she just worked hard enough and planned carefully enough. The belief had lasted until Richard's betrayal had shattered it, along with most of her ability to trust anyone beyond her lawyers and her executive board. Marcus Rivera had left his career in 2021, the same year the news article about the lawsuit settlement had appeared. Elena pulled it up again, reading more carefully this time, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Hartwell Emergency Solutions, a subsidiary that handled dispatch and coordination for medical response teams, had settled a wrongful death claim following a software glitch that had caused an 18-minute delay in ambulance arrival. The family of the deceased had received an undisclosed sum. Elena didn't remember the case specifically. She signed off on hundreds of legal settlements every year. But she pulled up the company's legal archives and found the file. The deceased's name was Isabel Rivera, age 32, occupation, emergency room nurse. Cause of death, internal hemorrhaging following a vehicle accident. The glitch in the dispatch system had sent the ambulance to the wrong location, and by the time the error had been corrected and emergency services arrived at the correct address, it was too late. Elena sat back in her chair and felt the full weight of it settle over her. Marcus Rivera's wife had died because Elena's company had failed her. Not Elena directly. The subsidiary operated with significant autonomy, and the CEO at the time had been Richard, who had cut corners on software testing to save money and boost quarterly profits. But it was still her company, still her family name on the building, still her responsibility. She had fired the entire management team after the lawsuit, shut down the subsidiary, and implemented new quality control measures across every division. It hadn't been enough to bring Isabel Rivera back. And now that same Marcus Rivera, who had every reason to hate everything associated with the Hartwell name, had saved Sophie's life without hesitation. Elena didn't know whether to be grateful or horrified. Both emotions churned in her chest as morning light filled the office and Sophie stirred in the next room, waking from whatever dreams or nightmares had filled her sleep. Elena closed the laptop and went to her daughter, pushing aside the questions and complications for later. There would be time to untangle the moral complexities of the situation. Right now, she needed to make sure Sophie ate breakfast and get her to school safely. Maintaining some semblance of normalcy in a world that had become suddenly and terrifyingly unpredictable. Main Street Coffee was busy at noon, filled with the lunch crowd from the nearby office buildings. Elena arrived 15 minutes early with Sophie in tow, having made the decision that morning not to leave her daughter with anyone, even the trusted nanny who had worked for the family for 3 years. Sophie clutched Clover and stayed pressed against Elena's side as they found a table near the back, away from the windows, but with a clear view of the entrance. Elena ordered tea she didn't intend to drink and a hot chocolate for Sophie that the child barely touched. Marcus Rivera arrived at exactly 12 o'clock. Elena watched him enter, saw the way his eyes swept the room in a single practiced motion that cataloged every exit and potential threat before he walked toward their table. He moved differently than he had in the parking garage, his gait smoother now, but there was still that quality of controlled readiness, as though he could shift from walking to running without the usual moment of transition most people needed. He wore jeans and a faded jacket, and in the daylight, Elena could see the lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of exhaustion worn so long it had become permanent. Sophie saw him and lit up, her small face transforming from withdrawn anxiety to something approaching joy. Before Elena could stop her, the child scrambled off her chair and ran to Marcus, pulling a piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She had drawn a picture in the car on the way over, 3 stick figures rendered in crayon. She pointed to the tallest one with fierce pride and declared that was him, the hero who had saved her. The medium figure was her, and the smallest was Clover. Elena watched Marcus crouch down to Sophie's eye level, his movements careful and unhurried. He examined the drawing with apparent seriousness, then told Sophie she was very brave and Clover was lucky to have her. His voice was gentle in a way Elena hadn't heard the previous night, lacking the flat emotional distance he had displayed when speaking to the security guards. Marcus accepted the drawing with quiet thanks and carefully folded it before putting it in his jacket pocket. Then he gently disentangled Sophie's fingers from where they had clutched at his sleeve and guided her back to Elena. He sat down across from them, his back to the wall in a way that gave him a clear view of the entrance and the street beyond. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Elena found herself studying his face, seeing details she had missed in the chaos of last night. A small scar above his left eyebrow, calloused hands that suggested years of hard physical work, eyes that were a dark brown, verging on black, and held a kind of weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. Elena broke the silence first, keeping her voice low enough that nearby tables wouldn't overhear. She told him the police had confirmed the truck had been deliberately sabotaged. Someone had tried to kill her or Sophie or both of them, and that person was still out there. Detective Chen had recommended private security, but Elena didn't want strangers. She wanted someone who understood how to read danger before it materialized, someone who had proven they would act without hesitation when a child's life was at stake. Her voice caught slightly as she said it. The memory of those terrible seconds when she had thought Sophie was being kidnapped, still too raw and fresh. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When Elena finished, he was quiet for several breaths before responding. He wasn't a bodyguard, Ms. Hartwell. He cleaned parking garages and office buildings. He had a son at home who needed him. Whatever training he'd had in his previous life was years behind him now, and he had no interest in revisiting it. Elena had anticipated this. She pulled out her phone and brought up the news article from 2018, turning the screen so Marcus could see his own younger face smiling back at him. She read the quote about human radar aloud, then looked up and met his eyes directly. She told him she knew who he was, technical rescue specialist with 12 years of experience and a decorated service record. She knew about the bridge collapse, the successful missions, the lives saved. She knew he understood threat assessment better than any private security firm she could hire, because he had spent over a decade training to spot danger in situations where seconds made the difference between survival and death. Something flickered in Marcus's expression, gone too quickly for Elena to identify, but leaving behind a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He asked the question she had been waiting for. Why did they want to hurt her? Or more specifically, why would someone target her daughter? Elena pulled out her laptop and opened the file she had prepared that morning. She walked him through the list of enemies, both personal and professional. Derek Ashford topped it. His company, DataMed Solutions, had been a strong competitor until they lost the major government contract to Hartwell MedTech last year. The loss had pushed them to the edge of bankruptcy. Victor Kane at BioCorp had spent 6 months trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover before Elena's board had shut him down decisively. Angela Torres had threatened litigation over trade secrets that Torres claimed Hartwell had stolen, though the case had fallen apart in discovery when Elena's lawyers proved Torres had fabricated the evidence. 2 former employees, both male executives who had been terminated for cause and filed wrongful termination suits that settled for undisclosed amounts. And Richard, her ex-husband, currently in prison for embezzlement, but with plenty of contacts on the outside who might be willing to do him favors. Marcus studied the list with the same careful attention he had given Sophie's drawing. Then he asked a question that cut through all the business analysis and corporate rivalry. Did any of these people hate Elena personally, not just professionally? Not someone who wanted to damage her company or steal her market share, but someone who despised her specifically enough to want her to suffer in the deepest way possible. Lena opened her mouth to answer and found herself uncertain. She had spent so many years thinking of herself as CEO of Hartwell MedTech that she had almost forgotten there was a person beneath the title. Most of the people she interacted with saw her as the company, an institution rather than an individual. The idea that someone hated her enough to murder her child felt abstract, incomprehensible, like trying to imagine a color that didn't exist. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting from the laptop screen to Elena's face. He told her flat out that the sabotage felt personal. A truck rolling down a ramp could have killed anyone, which made it a poor choice for a targeted attack if the goal was simply to harm Hartwell MedTech's leadership. But the truck had been positioned and timed to strike when Elena specifically would be collecting her daughter from daycare. Whoever had done this knew her schedule, knew where she parked, knew Sophie would be with her at that exact time. That level of knowledge suggested someone who had studied her routines carefully. And the choice to target Sophie rather than Elena directly suggested someone who wanted Elena to suffer, not just die. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of realization spreading outward. Sophie had gone very quiet, sensing the seriousness of the adult conversation even if she couldn't fully understand it. She pulled Clover close and buried her face in the stuffed rabbit's fur. Elena reached out automatically to stroke her daughter's hair, a gesture of comfort that felt inadequate, but was all she could offer. Marcus continued, his voice still quiet but carrying an intensity that demanded attention. If this person had failed once, they would try again. They had invested time and effort into planning the first attack. The next attempt would likely be different, adapted to account for whatever new security measures Elena put in place. Whoever they weren't done. They were escalating, and the next time they might succeed. Elena felt the truth of it settle over her like a physical weight. She looked at her daughter, small and vulnerable, and trusting that her mother would keep her safe. Then she looked at Marcus and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier. She asked him directly if he would consider helping her, not as an employee or contractor, but as a partner in keeping Sophie alive until Elena could figure out who was behind the attacks. She offered $5,000 per week, knowing even as she said it that the number was inadequate, but needing to put something concrete on the table. Marcus shook his head before she finished speaking. He told her he didn't work for money, his tone making it clear he found the offer vaguely insulting. But then his gaze drifted to Sophie, still hiding behind Clover, and something in his expression softened fractionally. Elena saw the moment he reconsidered, saw the internal calculation happening behind those exhausted eyes. She pressed the advantage carefully, pointing out that if the attacks escalated, his own son might be at risk simply by association once whoever was targeting her learned that Marcus was helping. It would be safer for both children if they stayed together, in Elena's home where she had security systems and resources. The logic was sound, even if the underlying emotion was manipulation. Marcus seemed to recognize both layers. He was silent for a long moment, his attention shifting between Elena and Sophie. When he finally spoke, he told her he would do it. Not for money, not for Elena, but for the little girl who reminded him too much of his own son. He had a condition, though. His son Dylan came with him. Elena agreed immediately, relief flooding through her chest with enough force that she felt momentarily dizzy. She gave Marcus her address, told him to pack what they needed and come that evening. He nodded once and stood, preparing to leave. Sophie reached out and grabbed his hand, her small voice asking if he was going to keep her safe from the bad people. Marcus looked down at her, and for the first time, Elena saw something crack in that carefully maintained emotional distance. He promised Sophie he would, then gently freed his hand and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. Elena sat at the table for several more minutes after he left, Sophie leaning against her side in exhausted silence. She had just invited a stranger into her home and her life, someone she knew almost nothing about beyond a handful of news articles and a single act of incredible bravery. It went against every instinct she had developed since Richard's betrayal, every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself and Sophie. But she had also just watched that stranger risk his own safety to save her daughter without a moment's hesitation. And sometimes trust had to be built on action rather than words. Marcus Rivera arrived at Elena's Pacific Heights estate at 7 that evening, driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic that looked out of place among the Teslas and BMWs lining the curved driveway. His son Dylan sat in the passenger seat, a backpack clutched on his lap, staring up at the mansion with an expression caught between wonder and apprehension. The house was everything Marcus's apartment wasn't: sprawling, pristine, wrapped in the kind of wealth that announced itself through understatement rather than ostentation. 5 bedrooms, Elena had mentioned on the phone, guest quarters with their own bathroom, a garden out back where the kids could play safely. Dylan's first words as they climbed out of the car carried the careful politeness of a child who had learned too young not to impose. "Is this a hotel, Dad?" Marcus told him no, they were helping a family who needed them. He reminded Dylan to be respectful, to remember his manners, to understand this was temporary. The boy nodded seriously, his dark eyes too old for 8 years, and followed his father up the stone steps to the front door. Elena answered before Marcus could knock, Sophie half hidden behind her mother's legs until she saw Dylan and Marcus. Then the little girl's face transformed, shyness giving way to something like relief. She held out Clover as though offering a precious gift and asked Dylan if he wanted to meet her friend. Dylan crouched down without hesitation, examining the stuffed rabbit with appropriate gravity. He told Sophie that Clover was beautiful, then asked if she liked Pokemon because he had brought his trading cards. The connection sparked instantly, 2 children recognizing in each other the particular loneliness of being raised by a single parent who carried too much weight. They disappeared into the house together, Sophie's small hand tucked into Dylan's larger one, leaving the adults to navigate the more complicated territory of their arrangement. Elena showed Marcus through the security system, a sophisticated network of cameras and sensors that covered every entrance and most of the property. Marcus walked the perimeter with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot vulnerabilities, and he found them everywhere. Blind spots where the camera angles didn't quite overlap. Windows on the second floor that could be reached with a ladder. Motion sensors that could be tricked by anyone who understood their timing patterns. The system was expensive and impressive, but it had been designed to deter casual criminals, not someone with professional training and a specific target. Marcus spent the next hour making modifications, using equipment he'd brought in a duffel bag that contained more tactical gear than Elena had expected. He installed pressure sensors beneath the first-floor windows, positioned to detect the subtle weight shift of someone attempting to enter. He recalibrated the motion detectors to ignore small animals, but trip on anything larger than 30 pounds moving at certain speeds. He added a redundant alert system that would send silent notifications to both his phone and Elena's if any sensor was triggered, bypassing the main security panel that could potentially be hacked or disabled. When Elena asked where he'd learned to do this, Marcus's answer was brief. Rescue operations require knowing how buildings fail and how people break into places they shouldn't be. Dinner was prepared by Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who had worked for Elena since before Sophie was born. The older woman served pot roast and vegetables with minimal commentary, though Marcus caught her studying him with the shrewd assessment of someone who had seen many people come and go from this house. The meal itself was awkward at first. 4 people navigating the strange intimacy of sharing food in what was technically Elena's space but needed to feel like neutral ground if they were going to function as a unit. Dylan and Sophie carried most of the conversation, talking about school and favorite foods and the elaborate rules of Pokemon battles that neither adult fully understood. Marcus found himself watching Elena when she wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the CEO who had screamed at him in the parking garage with the mother who cut Sophie's meat into careful bites and reminded her daughter to drink her milk. There was a softness to her in these moments, a vulnerability that vanished the instant she sensed his attention and her spine straightened reflexively. He recognized the defense mechanism because he employed the same one himself. The careful construction of walls to keep people at a distance where they couldn't see the damage underneath. After dinner, Sophie asked if Marcus would read her a bedtime story. Elena started to object, some instinct about boundaries and appropriate relationships between children and relative strangers. But Sophie's face held such hopeful expectation that the words died unspoken. Marcus followed the little girl upstairs to her bedroom, a space decorated in soft purples and whites with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling in constellation patterns that were almost but not quite astronomically accurate. Sophie handed him a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are and climbed into bed, Clover tucked under one arm. Marcus read the story in the same quiet voice he used with Dylan when nightmares made sleep impossible, and he watched Sophie's eyes grow heavy as Max sailed back from the land of wild things to find his supper waiting. By the time he finished, the child was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Marcus set the book on the nightstand and stood to leave, but Elena was in the doorway watching. Her expression held something he couldn't quite identify, gratitude perhaps, or maybe envy that her daughter had sought comfort from someone else. They went downstairs together, the house settling into the particular quiet that comes after children sleep. Dylan had already retreated to the guest room, unpacking his few belongings with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary spaces feel like home. Marcus and Elena ended up on the back patio, the lights of San Francisco spreading out below them like a circuit board, each building a node in a vast electronic network. The night air carried the salt smell of the bay mixed with jasmine from the garden. Elena broke the silence first, her voice carrying a thread of something raw beneath the usual controlled tone. "Thank you for coming, for agreeing to help despite having every reason not to." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about Isabel, about the file he'd found buried in Hartwell MedTech's legal archives when he'd done his research the night before. The settlement had been generous by corporate standards, a 7-figure payout that was supposed to make the pain go away and ensure the family wouldn't pursue further litigation. Marcus had refused to touch the money. It sat in an account somewhere, accruing interest he would never spend, because accepting it would have meant agreeing that Isabel's life had a monetary value that could be negotiated and closed out like a business transaction. He told Elena that her daughter wasn't responsible for the failures of her mother's company. Sophie deserved protection regardless of what connections existed between the adults in her life. It was the truth, but not the whole truth, and Marcus could feel the weight of the omission sitting heavy in his chest. He hadn't told Elena that he knew about Isabel, about the dispatch system that had failed at the worst possible moment. Hadn't told her that he was standing in her house, eating her food, protecting her child, all while carrying the knowledge that her family's company had killed his wife through negligence and cost-cutting measures designed to boost quarterly profits. Elena asked about his wife, the question casual but carrying an undertone that suggested she sensed there was more to his story than he'd revealed. Marcus kept his answer short. Isabel had died 3 years ago in an accident. They had a good marriage, A son who needed both parents, and then suddenly Dylan only had him. He didn't elaborate, and Elena didn't push, though he could see questions forming behind her eyes that she chose not to voice. Instead, she told him about her own divorce, words spilling out with the kind of relief that comes from finally saying things that have been held back too long. Richard had been everything she thought she wanted, ambitious, charming, from the right family with the right connections. They'd built Hartwell MedTech together, or so she'd believed. The truth was Richard had been building his own fortune through embezzlement so carefully hidden that Elena hadn't discovered it until the FBI arrived with a warrant. The betrayal wasn't just the money, it was the affair with the CFO, the years of lies told with such practiced ease that Elena had started questioning whether anything in their marriage had been real. When the dust settled and Richard was convicted, Elena was left with a company to rebuild and a 6-month-old daughter to raise alone. Her voice had gone flat by the end of it, emotion leached away by repetition. Since then, I don't trust anyone, just numbers and contracts and things I can verify independently. Marcus heard the implicit question underneath. Why was she trusting him now? He didn't have a good answer beyond necessity and the fact that Sophie was still alive because he'd acted without thought for his own safety. Sometimes trust had to be built on instinct rather than data, though he understood why that concept would be foreign to someone whose life had been shattered by misplaced faith. They sat in silence after that, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as weighted with things neither of them was ready to say. Eventually, Elena excused herself, claiming exhaustion, though Marcus suspected she simply needed space from the vulnerability she'd just displayed. He stayed on the patio longer, staring out at the city lights and thinking about the complicated web of connections that had brought him to this place. His wife had died because of Hartwell company negligence. Now he was living in a Hartwell house, protecting a Hartwell child, all while hiding the very information that would make Elena understand why he had every reason to refuse this arrangement. The rational part of his mind said he should tell her. The angry part, the piece of him that still woke up some mornings expecting to find Isabel beside him, said she deserved to know what her family's pursuit of profit had cost. But the part of him that had seen Sophie's face light up when Dylan showed her his Pokemon cards, the part that recognized how Dylan smiled more in 3 hours here than he had in 3 months at their apartment, that part said to wait, to protect these children who hadn't asked to be caught in the crossfire of adult decisions and corporate malfeasance, to focus on keeping them safe until whoever had sabotaged that truck was caught and punished. Marcus went to bed after midnight, lying awake in the guest room that was larger than his entire apartment's living space, and tried not to think about how quickly temporary situations could become permanent if you weren't careful. Dylan was already asleep in the other bed, his breathing soft and even, one hand curled around the Pokemon cards he'd been showing Sophie earlier. Marcus watched his son and made a silent promise that he would protect both these children, would do whatever necessary to ensure they didn't suffer the way he and Dylan had suffered when Isabel died. Even if it meant working with a woman whose last name was synonymous with everything that had destroyed his life. The routine established itself over the following 3 days with surprising ease. Marcus woke before dawn each morning, habit from years of early shift work, and did a full perimeter check of the property. He drove Dylan and Sophie to school together, varying the route each day while teaching Dylan how to spot when someone might be following them. The boy absorbed the lessons with the seriousness of a student who understood the stakes, asking intelligent questions about mirror placement and what to look for in traffic patterns. Sophie sat in the back seat clutching Clover, trusting absolutely that the adults would keep her safe. Elena worked from home, conducting video conferences from her office, while Marcus established himself in the study down the hall. He'd convinced her to give him access to the company's security systems, not just the house but the corporate headquarters and the parking structure where the attack had occurred. During the day while the children were at school, Marcus reviewed footage and built a database of every vehicle and person who had appeared near Elena's parking spot in the month leading up to the sabotage. The work was tedious, but he'd done similar analysis during rescue operations, looking for patterns and structural failures that could predict future collapses. Elena joined him most afternoons, bringing coffee and her own laptop. She'd set up an AI monitoring system that analyzed the security camera feeds in real time, flagging suspicious behavior patterns and logging license plates that appeared repeatedly. Marcus was impressed despite himself. The system was more sophisticated than anything he'd worked with during his time in emergency response. Elena explained that it was adapted from software Hartwell MedTech had developed for hospital security, designed to identify potential threats before they materialized into actual violence. They worked in companionable silence, punctuated by occasional discussion of findings. Marcus noticed that Elena's initial stiffness around him had begun to soften, replaced by something approaching professional respect. She asked questions about his tactical assessments without the underlying skepticism he'd come to expect from executives who believed their business degrees made them experts in everything. In turn, Marcus found himself explaining concepts he'd thought he'd never discuss again: threat matrices, probability cascades, the way emergency situations tended to follow predictable patterns if you knew what to look for. On the third evening, Marcus built a comprehensive threat analysis that he presented to Elena after the children were asleep. He'd identified 3 types of attack that remained viable given the new security measures: an ambush during school pickup or drop-off, a home invasion timed to when Elena was alone or distracted, and a cyber attack targeting the house security systems or Elena's personal devices. Each scenario had multiple sub-variations, contingency plans that a determined attacker might employ if their initial approach failed. Elena studied the document with the focused attention of someone reading a contract worth millions. When she finished, she looked up and asked the question Marcus had been waiting for. Who among her enemies was capable of this level of planning and had the motivation to see it through? Marcus pulled up the files she'd shared during their first meeting, spreading them across his laptop screen. Derek Ashford had the strongest financial motive. DataMed Solutions had been on the verge of a major breakthrough before losing the government contract to Hartwell MedTech. The loss had triggered a cascade of investor withdrawals that pushed the company to the edge of bankruptcy, but financial grudges usually manifested as corporate espionage or lawsuits, not physical attacks on children. Victor Kane's attempted hostile takeover had been aggressive, but ultimately business-focused. He'd moved on to other targets after Elena's board shut him down. Angela Torres had been publicly humiliated when her trade secrets case fell apart, but her response had been to retreat from the industry rather than seek revenge. The former employees both had restraining orders preventing them from coming within 500 feet of Elena or Hartwell property. That left Richard, currently serving time at San Quentin, but with connections that predated his conviction. Marcus asked if Elena's ex-husband was the vindictive type, whether he might blame her for his imprisonment rather than accepting responsibility for his own crimes. Elena's expression went carefully neutral as she considered the question. Richard had always been good at convincing himself that other people's actions were responsible for his failures. The embezzlement was the FBI's fault for investigating. The affair was Elena's fault for being too focused on work. The divorce was her lawyer's fault for being unnecessarily aggressive. It was entirely possible he'd constructed a narrative where Elena had destroyed his life deliberately, and where taking Sophie would be justified as balancing some imagined scale. But Richard was in prison, Marcus pointed out. Even with outside contacts, orchestrating something this sophisticated from inside required resources and loyalty that most white-collar criminals didn't inspire. Unless there was someone else, someone who benefited from both Richard's removal from the company and Elena's current vulnerability, someone who might be positioning themselves to take control of Hartwell MedTech in the chaos that would follow Elena's breakdown or death. Elena's face had gone pale as Marcus laid out the possibility. She pulled up the company's organizational chart, highlighting the executives who had the most to gain from her departure. 3 names stood out: the current CFO who had replaced Richard, the head of research and development who had opposed several of Elena's strategic decisions, and the chief operating officer who had been passed over for CEO when Elena's father retired. Any of them could have the means and motive, though proving it would require more than pattern analysis and circumstantial evidence. They were still discussing possibilities when Marcus's phone buzzed with an alert. One of the pressure sensors on a first-floor window had been triggered. Marcus was on his feet instantly, pulling the handgun from his ankle holster with practiced efficiency. Elena stared at the weapon, shock registering on her features. She hadn't known he was armed. Marcus didn't take time to explain. He gestured for her to stay in the office and moved toward the stairs with the economical motion of someone who had practiced room-clearing exercises until they became muscle memory. The window in question was in the laundry room. Mahoney, a space Elena rarely used since Mrs. Chen handled all the household maintenance. Marcus approached from an angle that kept him out of direct line of sight, weapon low and ready. The window was intact, no signs of forced entry, but the sensor was definitely registering weight where there shouldn't be any. He scanned the surrounding area through the glass and caught movement. A cat, probably belonging to a neighbor, that had jumped onto the exterior windowsill and set off the sensitive pressure plate. Marcus holstered his weapon and checked the sensor calibration, adjusting it to ignore anything under 20 pounds. False alarm this time, but the adrenaline spike had been real enough that his hands were shaking slightly as he made the adjustments. He'd spent 3 years trying to leave this life behind, trying to be a normal person who didn't see threats in every shadow and calculate exit strategies from every room he entered. Being back in this headspace was both familiar and deeply uncomfortable, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he still stood to lose if he let himself become invested in protecting this family. Elena was waiting in the hallway when he emerged, her face tense with worry that transformed into relief when she saw he was unharmed. She asked about the gun, where he'd gotten it, and whether it was legal. Marcus showed her his concealed carry permit, issued on the basis of his law enforcement connections and emergency response background. He'd started carrying after Isabel died, some irrational part of him believing that if he was armed, he could prevent the next disaster. It hadn't helped with his grief, but it had become habit, and tonight that habit might have made the difference between life and death if the sensor had been triggered by an actual intruder rather than a stray cat. Elena's response surprised him. "Thank God you had it. I should have asked earlier what you'd need to do this properly." The easy acceptance did something to Marcus's carefully maintained emotional distance. Most people reacted to firearms with fear or moral disapproval, especially in California, where gun ownership was more controversial than in other parts of the country. Elena's pragmatic acknowledgement that violence might be necessary to protect her daughter suggested a flexibility of thinking that Marcus hadn't expected from someone raised in wealth and privilege. They went back to the office, but the working session was effectively over, both of them too wired from the false alarm to focus. Instead, they talked, trading pieces of their histories in the way people do when proximity and danger have accelerated the usual timeline of relationship building. Elena described growing up in her father's shadow, being groomed from childhood to take over the family company, but never quite feeling like she measured up to his expectations. She'd thrown herself into work as a way to prove her worth, and by the time she realized she'd sacrificed her marriage and most of her youth in the pursuit of approval that would never come, her father was dead and she was CEO of a company she'd never wanted to run. Marcus shared his own trajectory from idealistic recruit to decorated rescue specialist to broken man cleaning parking garages for minimum wage. He described the rush of successful extractions, the way it felt to pull someone alive from rubble that should have killed them, the addictive nature of being the person everyone else looked to when situations went wrong. And he described the hollowness that followed Isabel's death, the way every subsequent rescue felt meaningless because he'd failed at the one that mattered most. He'd quit not because he'd lost his skills, but because he couldn't bear the weight of being responsible for other people's survival when he'd proven so spectacularly inadequate at protecting his own family. The conversation went until past 2 a.m, far longer than either of them had intended. When they finally separated to their rooms, Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of Elena Hartwell. She wasn't the ice queen he'd built up in his imagination, the corporate executive whose company had killed his wife through callous negligence. She was a complicated person doing her best with impossible circumstances, trying to be a good mother while running a business she'd never wanted, struggling with the same loneliness and sense of inadequacy that Marcus carried. It didn't absolve Hartwell MedTech of responsibility for Isabel's death, but it made the moral calculus more complex than the simple anger Marcus had been nursing for 3 years. The attack came 6 days after Marcus moved in, and it came exactly the way he'd predicted it would, during the vulnerable window of the school pickup. Marcus was driving Elena's Mercedes with both children in back, having convinced her that his tactical training made him the better choice for situations where split-second decisions might be necessary. They just left the private elementary school both kids attended when Marcus noticed the sedan 2 cars back that had been behind them since they'd left the house that morning. He didn't mention it to the children, just adjusted his route to take them through a residential area where traffic patterns would make it obvious if someone was following. The sedan stayed with them through 3 turns that made no sense for anyone heading in their original direction. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel as he ran probability calculations. The car could be another parent from the school who happened to live in the same neighborhood, or it could be surveillance, someone tracking their movements to establish patterns for a future attack. The decision tree collapsed when a second vehicle, a dark SUV, pulled out from a side street and blocked the intersection ahead. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds to react. He could reverse and try to flee back the way they'd come, but the sedan behind had closed the distance and would prevent that. He could attempt to ram through the SUV, but the Mercedes wasn't built for that kind of impact, and the children's safety couldn't be guaranteed. Or he could accept that this was a trap and focus on extraction rather than escape. Marcus chose the third option. He pulled the Mercedes to the curb with enough force that the tires screeched, killed the engine, and turned to face the children in the back seat. His voice was absolutely calm despite the adrenaline dumping into his bloodstream. "Dylan, take Sophie and run to that house with the blue door. Ring the bell and tell whoever answers to call 911. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the police. Go now." Dylan grabbed Sophie's hand and they scrambled out the passenger side door, away from the street where both vehicles had stopped and doors were opening. Marcus positioned himself between the children and the emerging figures. 3 men in total, all wearing ski masks despite the mild afternoon weather. They were professionals, or at least well-prepared amateurs, moving with coordinated efficiency that suggested either military training or extensive planning. The lead man pulled something from his jacket, and Marcus's hand went to his holster. But the object wasn't a weapon. It was a tablet displaying a video call interface. The man held it up so Marcus could see the screen, and Derek Ashford's face stared back at him. The former CEO of Data Med Solutions looked haggard, eyes red-rimmed and wild, but his voice was steady as he spoke. "I want Elena, not her hired help, not her daughter, just Elena. You have 30 seconds to get her on the phone before we take the girl by force." Marcus kept his gun holstered, but his hand rested on the grip, ready to draw and fire if any of the 3 men moved toward the house where Dylan and Sophie had vanished. He told Ashford that wasn't going to happen, his tone conversational, despite the elevated heart rate he could feel pounding in his ears. If Ashford wanted Elena, he could make an appointment through proper channels like any other businessman. Derek's face contorted with something between rage and grief. "You don't understand. You can't understand. Catherine is dead because of that woman. My wife killed herself, and it's Elena Hartwell's fault. So yes, I want her on the phone. I want her to hear her daughter screaming. I want her to feel 1% of what I've felt every day since I found Catherine in the bathtub with her wrist slit open." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Marcus had reviewed the financial records, but he hadn't dug into the personal costs of DataMed's collapse. He did a quick mental calculation. If Ashford's wife had died by suicide after the company failed, and if Derek blamed Elena for that failure, then the attacks weren't about business competition or corporate espionage. They were revenge, pure and simple. The kind of vendetta that didn't end until one party was dead or the other was satisfied that enough suffering had been inflicted to balance some internal scale of justice. Marcus's voice stayed level as he responded, "I'm sorry about your wife, genuinely, but hurting a 6-year-old child won't bring her back. It will just destroy more families and add more grief to a world that already has too much of it." Derek's response was immediate and vicious. "That's the point. Elena needs to understand loss. She needs to wake up every morning remembering what she had and doesn't anymore. She needs to live with that hole in her chest where her heart used to be. Death is too easy. This is justice." Behind Marcus, he could hear sirens approaching. One of the 3 masked men heard them too and gestured to the others, preparing to retreat. But Derek's voice cut through the tablet speaker one more time, carrying a promise that made Marcus's blood run cold. "This isn't over. Tell Elena I'm coming for her and everyone she loves. Tell her Catherine says hello from hell." The connection cut. The 3 men retreated to their vehicles with practiced speed, the sedan and SUV disappearing around opposite corners before the police could arrive. Marcus stood in the street, hands still on his holstered weapon, and processed what had just happened. They'd gotten lucky this time. The men had been there to terrorize and deliver a message rather than to actually kidnap Sophie. But Derek Ashford was escalating, his grief and rage pushing him toward increasingly desperate actions. The next attack wouldn't be a warning. The police took statements from Marcus, Dylan, and Sophie, though the children had little to add beyond descriptions of the men and vehicles. Detective Chen arrived within 20 minutes, her expression grim as Marcus walked her through the confrontation in Derek's video call confession. She immediately put out a warrant for Ashford's arrest on kidnapping and terroristic threat charges, but both she and Marcus knew the man was likely already far from San Francisco. People didn't orchestrate this kind of operation without planning their escape route in advance. Elena arrived at the scene 15 minutes after the police. Having driven from downtown the moment Marcus called, she pulled Dylan and Sophie into a desperate embrace, checking them over with frantic hands to assure herself they were unharmed. When she was satisfied the children were safe, she turned to Marcus, and he could see the question forming before she voiced it. Why didn't Derek take Sophie when he had the chance? If his goal was to make Elena suffer, kidnapping her daughter would have been the most direct path. Marcus had been considering the same question. His answer came slowly, thinking through the implications as he spoke, because taking Sophie would have brought immediate law enforcement response and likely ended with Ashford in custody or dead. This way, he's free to continue escalating while keeping Elena in constant terror about when and how he'll strike next. It's more sophisticated than I gave him credit for. He's not just seeking revenge. He's trying to torture her psychologically until the actual attack becomes almost a relief. Elena's face had gone white as she processed the assessment. Detective Chen made a small sound of agreement, adding that they'd pulled Ashford's full background during the drive over. The man had no military or tactical training, but he'd been seeing a psychiatrist since his wife's death and had recently stopped attending sessions. The therapist, when contacted under the emergency provisions that allowed breaking doctor-patient confidentiality for imminent threats, reported that Derek had been fixating on Elena as the source of all his problems. Classic displacement, unable to process his own guilt over failing to prevent Catherine's suicide, he'd externalized the blame onto someone else. The children were subdued on the drive home, even Dylan's usual steady composure shaken by how close they'd come to real danger. Sophie wouldn't let go of Clover and kept asking if the bad men were going to come to the house. Marcus promised her they weren't, explained the security measures in place, tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. If Derek Ashford was willing to risk a daylight abduction attempt on a residential street, he would certainly be bold enough to try a home invasion despite the cameras and sensors. That night, after the children were finally settled in Dylan's room because neither of them wanted to sleep alone, Marcus found Elena sitting in Sophie's empty bedroom. She turned on the glow-in-the-dark stars but left the other lights off, and in the green phosphorescent glow her face looked younger and more vulnerable than Marcus had ever seen it. When she spoke, her voice carried the hollowness of someone confronting a truth they'd been avoiding. I killed his wife. Not directly, but the chain of causation is clear enough. I beat him in a contract bid. His company failed. The stress contributed to Catherine's suicide. He's right that it's my fault. Marcus sat down in the chair next to where Elena had positioned herself on Sophie's bed. That's not how responsibility works. You competed for a contract and won because your company made a better offer. That's business, not murder. Catherine Ashford's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't inevitable. Derek could have declared bankruptcy and started over. Catherine could have sought treatment for her depression. They made choices, just like you made choices, and sometimes those choices lead to terrible outcomes that nobody intended. Elena shook her head. You're being generous. The truth is, I've spent so many years focused on winning that I never stopped to consider what winning cost the people who lost. Derek's company wasn't just a competitor, it was his life's work. Catherine wasn't just collateral damage. She was a person who couldn't survive what I did to her family. And now he wants to do the same thing to me, and maybe I deserve it. The words hit Marcus with unexpected force because they echoed thoughts he'd had about himself after Isabel died. He'd been so focused on being the best rescue specialist, on saving the most people, and building the most impressive career, that he'd taken his wife for granted. He'd missed anniversaries and birthdays, had prioritized the job over their relationship, had assumed Isabel would always be there waiting when he finally had time to focus on family. And then she'd needed him for the one rescue that mattered, and he'd failed. And some part of him believed he deserved the grief that followed because he hadn't valued what he had until it was gone. But 3 years of living with that guilt had taught Marcus something important. Sometimes the people hurt by the choices you make deserve compassion, and sometimes they deserve justice. But you don't get to decide that by punishing yourself. Guilt is a warning light, not a life sentence. It tells you where you made mistakes so you can do better going forward. It doesn't give you permission to let someone murder your child because you feel bad about business decisions. Elena looked at him with eyes that reflected the green starlight. How do you live with it? The guilt of surviving when someone else didn't. Marcus's throat tightened as the question landed in territory he'd never fully mapped. You don't. Not really. You just keep moving forward because the people still depending on you deserve better than watching you drown. Dylan needed a father more than I needed to wallow in self-pity. Sophie needs a mother who protects her, not one who believes she deserves to suffer. They sat in silence after that. Two people who had each lost something irreplaceable and were trying to build lives from the wreckage. Eventually, Elena stood and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thank you for today, for protecting them, for seeing me as a person instead of just a name on a building. After she left, Marcus stayed in Sophie's room, staring at the artificial stars and thinking about Derek Ashford's face on that tablet screen. The man's pain had been real and raw, the kind of grief that poisoned everything it touched. Marcus understood that feeling intimately. The difference was that Marcus had chosen to channel his loss into keeping Dylan safe and trying to prevent other families from experiencing what he'd gone through. Derek had chosen to let his grief metastasize into a crusade that would only create more casualties. But understanding Derek's motivation didn't make stopping him any easier. The man had resources, connections, and the kind of desperate focus that came from having nothing left to lose. He'd proven he could get close to Sophie despite security measures and police awareness, and he'd made his intentions crystal clear. This wasn't going to stop until Elena suffered the way he believed she'd made him suffer. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the file he'd been building on Derek Ashford, adding notes from today's encounter. The pattern was escalating exactly as he'd predicted in his threat assessment: harassment, attempted vehicular homicide, and now a bold daylight confrontation. The next step would likely be either a direct assault on Elena or another attempt to kidnap Sophie, this time with more thorough planning to account for the security measures that had failed today. Marcus needed to find Derek before that happened, needed to identify where the man was hiding and what resources he had access to. He worked through the night, cross-referencing Derek's known associates with property records and financial transactions. By dawn, he had a list of 3 properties that Derek either owned through shell companies or had connections to through his remaining business partners. Marcus sent the information to Detective Chen with a recommendation for immediate search warrants, then went downstairs to find Elena already awake, staring at her laptop screen with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept. She'd been doing her own research, pulling up everything she could find about Catherine Ashford's death. The coroner's report was a matter of public record: slashed wrists in a bathtub, blood alcohol level suggesting heavy drinking beforehand, a suicide note that apologized to Derek and their children for not being strong enough. Catherine had been 38, a former teacher who had stopped working when DataMed started to fail so she could help Derek from home. Her death had come 3 weeks after the company declared bankruptcy, 2 days after their eldest son had called from college to say he was dropping out because they couldn't afford tuition anymore. Elena's voice was raw as she read the details aloud. She had depression and anxiety, diagnosed years before. She'd been on medication but stopped taking it when their insurance lapsed. Derek found her in their master bathroom while their younger daughter was at a friend's house. The note said she loved them but couldn't stand being the reason they had nothing left. Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing the need Elena had to understand the full scope of what her business victory had cost. When she finished, he asked the question she'd been avoiding. If you could go back and lose that contract knowing what it would lead to, would you? Elena's silence stretched long enough that Marcus thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, I don't know. Is one family's tragedy worth more than the thousands of patients who benefited from Hartwell's medical technology? Is Catherine's life worth more than the 300 employees at my company who depend on us staying competitive? I want to say yes, that no amount of success justifies what happened to the Ashfords. But the CEO in me knows that's not how business works. You make the best decision you can with the information available, and sometimes people get hurt, and if you let that paralyze you, then nothing ever gets done. The honesty was brutal, and Marcus respected her for it. Most people would have offered comfortable lies about how they do everything differently, how the tragedy was unforeseeable and therefore not truly their responsibility. Elena at least owned her choices and their consequences, even if she couldn't quite bring herself to condemn the calculus that had led to them. His phone buzzed with a message from Detective Chen. The search warrants had been approved, and SWAT teams were moving on the 3 properties Marcus had identified. One was empty, abandoned months ago. The second was occupied by a former DataMed employee who claimed he hadn't spoken to Derek in over a year. But the third, a warehouse space in the industrial district near Pier 40, showed signs of recent activity. Police were preparing to breach within the hour. Marcus told Elena they should stay away and let law enforcement handle this. But even as he said it, he knew she wouldn't listen. This was her fault, in the way that chains of causation were always partly everyone's fault and partly nobody's, and she needed to see it through to the end. They left the children with Mrs. Chen under strict instructions not to open the door for anyone, then drove to the warehouse district in tense silence. They arrived to find police vehicles blocking off a 3-block radius, SWAT vans positioned at strategic points, and Detective Chen arguing with her commanding officer about something Marcus couldn't hear from this distance. Chen spotted them and walked over, her expression grim. Ashford's inside. We've got the building surrounded. Negotiator is trying to establish contact, but he's not responding to calls or the loudspeaker. The man who attacked you this afternoon is in there too. We ID'd him from traffic cameras as one of Derek's former employees. No sign of the other 2 yet. Lena's hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. What happens now? Chen's answer was professional but carried an undercurrent of concern. We wait. We try to talk him out. If that doesn't work and he presents an immediate threat to himself or others, we go in hard. But Ms. Hartwell, you should not be here. If Derek sees you, it could escalate things in ways we can't predict. Before Elena could respond, the warehouse's main door opened and a figure emerged with hands raised. It was the man from the tablet video, the one who had delivered Derek's message. He walked forward slowly, calling out that Derek wanted to talk to Elena Hartwell directly. He wanted her to come inside alone to discuss terms. If she didn't, Derek would detonate explosives he'd wired throughout the building. The claim might have been a bluff, but the tremor in the man's voice suggested he believed it was real. The commanding officer refused immediately. We don't negotiate with terrorists, and we certainly don't send civilians into active hostage situations. Ms. Hartwell stays here. But Marcus was watching Elena's face, seeing the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was considering it, weighing the risk to herself against the chance that going inside might somehow resolve this without anyone else getting hurt. He grabbed her arm before she could voice what she was thinking. Don't. This is exactly what Derek wants. You at his mercy, isolated, vulnerable. The best way to protect Sophie is to stay alive and let the professionals handle this. Elena pulled her arm free. And what if Derek really has explosives? What if people die because I wouldn't walk through that door? How is that different from all the other times my decisions led to casualties I never had to see? The argument was cut off by the sound of gunfire from inside the warehouse. 3 shots in rapid succession, followed by shouting. The SWAT team moved immediately, breaching the door and flowing inside with tactical precision. Marcus pushed Elena behind one of the police vehicles, using his body to shield her from any potential return fire. They waited in agonizing tension for 5 minutes that felt like hours before Detective Chen emerged and walked over to them. Her expression told the story before she spoke. Derek Ashford is dead. Self-inflicted gunshot wound. The other man, the one who came out, is in custody. No explosives were found. That was a bluff to lure you inside. But we did find plans, Ms. Hartwell. Detailed schematics of your home, your office, Sophie's school, photographs of you and your daughter going back months. This man was preparing something much worse than what he's already attempted. Elena sagged against the police vehicle, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. Marcus kept his hand on her shoulder, steadying her while Chen continued. There's more. We found Derek's laptop open to a document he'd been writing. It's essentially a manifesto explaining his actions, addressed to his children. In it, he acknowledges that killing Sophie wouldn't bring Catherine back and wouldn't actually make him feel better. He says he understands now that pain can't be cured with more pain. He apologizes for what he put them through and asks them to forgive him for not being the father they deserved after their mother died. Marcus felt something shift in his chest as the words landed. Derek Ashford had reached the same conclusion Marcus had come to after Isabel's death. That grief unchecked could poison everything. That revenge was just another form of suffering. That the only way forward was to choose a different path even if the destination remained unclear. But Derek had reached that understanding too late, after already crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The tragedy was that with better support, better mental health care, better options than bankruptcy and desperation, maybe Catherine Ashford would still be alive. Maybe Derek would be getting therapy instead of lying dead in a warehouse. Maybe Elena wouldn't be standing here trying to process the fact that a man had nearly killed her daughter and then killed himself because a business contract had set off a cascade of consequences nobody could have predicted. They drove back to the house in silence. Sophie and Dylan were right where they'd left them, building an elaborate Pokemon battle scene with trading cards and stuffed animals. The children looked up as Elena entered, Sophie's face brightening. Did you catch the bad men? Elena knelt down and pulled her daughter into a hug. Yes, baby. The bad men are gone. You're safe now. It was both true and a lie. The kind of simplified version of reality that parents offered to children who didn't need to know the full complexity of adult choices and their consequences. Sophie accepted it with the faith of a 6-year-old who trusted that her mother could fix anything. Dylan met Marcus's eyes over the girls' heads, his expression carrying a maturity that made Marcus's heart ache. The boy knew whatever had happened today wasn't as simple as catching bad men, but he was willing to pretend for Sophie's sake. That night, after both children were finally asleep, Marcus sat on the back patio alone. Elena had retreated to her room, overwhelmed by the day's events. The city lights spread out below, each window representing lives being lived in ignorance of the violence and desperation that had nearly played out in their midst. Marcus thought about Derek Ashford's final words, the apology to his children that had come too late to prevent the damage his grief had caused. He thought about Catherine Ashford, a woman he'd never met, but whose death had set this entire chain of events in motion. He thought about Isabel, about the ways trauma could either break you completely or forge you into something harder and more determined to prevent others from suffering the same fate. And he thought about Elena, about the complicated person she'd revealed herself to be over the past week. She wasn't the villain Derek had painted her as, but she also wasn't blameless. She'd made choices that prioritized business success over empathy, that treated competitors as abstractions rather than people with families and futures at stake. But she was trying to do better, to learn from mistakes, to be the kind of mother Sophie deserved even if she'd failed in some ways, to be the kind of wife Richard had needed, or the kind of CEO who prioritized people over profits. Marcus didn't have easy answers. He'd spent 3 years angry at Hartwell MedTech for the system failures that killed Isabel, and that anger had been justified. But spending time with Elena had complicated the simple narrative of corporate villainy he'd constructed. The company had failed, yes, but it had failed because Richard Hartwell had cut corners to maximize profits, and Elena had trusted her husband's judgment without sufficient oversight. She bore responsibility for not catching the problem sooner, but she'd also implemented reforms after Isabel's death that had likely prevented future tragedies. The question was whether acknowledging her efforts at redemption meant Marcus was betraying Isabel's memory, or whether refusing to acknowledge them meant he was letting grief trap him in the past, rather than moving toward whatever future might still be possible. The weeks following Derek Ashford's death brought a strange, hollow peace to Elena's household. The immediate threat had been eliminated. Detective Chen confirmed that the 2 other men involved in the attempted abduction had been arrested and charged as accessories, and the media coverage gradually faded as newer tragedies captured public attention. But Marcus noticed the way Elena still checked the security feeds compulsively each morning, the way Sophie refused to sleep without her bedroom door open and a nightlight bright enough to read by. Trauma didn't evaporate simply because the danger had passed. Marcus should have moved out. The arrangement had been temporary, protection during an active crisis. With Derek gone and no other credible threats identified, there was no justification for him and Dylan to continue occupying Elena's guest quarters. But Dylan had started to smile again, genuinely smile in a way Marcus hadn't seen since Isabel died. Sophie followed Dylan everywhere, chattering about Pokemon and school projects and asking his opinion on which books to read next. The two children had become inseparable, filling gaps in each other's lives that neither adult had fully recognized existed. Elena approached Marcus on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, finding him in the kitchen making breakfast, while Dylan taught Sophie how to flip pancakes without splattering batter everywhere. Her voice carried careful neutrality as she asked if they could talk privately. Marcus followed her to the study, his stomach tightening with anticipation of the conversation he had been dreading. She was going to thank him politely for his service and ask when he planned to leave. Instead, Elena pulled up a document on her laptop and turned the screen toward him. It was a job offer, Director of Security Operations for Hartwell MedTech, with a salary that made Marcus's throat close up and a benefits package that included full college tuition coverage for dependent children. The position would involve overseeing all security protocols across the company's facilities, training staff in threat recognition and emergency response, and serving as Elena's personal security advisor for high-risk situations. It was a real job with real responsibilities, not charity dressed up as employment. Marcus stared at the screen for a long moment before finding words. Elena's answer came without hesitation. Because you're better at this than anyone I could hire from a private security firm. Because Dylan and Sophie are happy together, and I don't want to be the reason they lose that. Because I trust you, which is not something I say lightly or often, and I think you might be starting to trust me too, despite having every reason not to. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Marcus could feel the fault lines in his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack. He'd spent 3 weeks living in this house, eating meals with Elena and the children, falling into routines that felt dangerously close to family. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he was just doing a bro, that the comfortable domesticity was an illusion that would shatter as soon as the crisis ended. But the crisis had ended and he was still here, still making pancakes with Dylan while Elena worked in her office, still reading bedtime stories to Sophie when nightmares woke her at 2 a.m, and he still hadn't told Elena the truth about Isabel. The secret sat like a stone in his chest, growing heavier each day he chose not to speak. He'd rationalized the silence at first. Telling her would have been cruel while she was already dealing with Derek's attacks, would have served no purpose except to assuage Marcus's own guilt about accepting her hospitality under false pretenses. But 3 weeks was long enough that the deception had become its own betrayal, a foundational lie that undermined everything they'd been building. Marcus heard himself asking a question he hadn't planned. Did you know? About the Emergency Solutions subsidiary, about Isabel Rivera, about the settlement your company paid out in 2021. Elena's face went carefully blank, the CEO mask sliding into place. I know we settled a wrongful death lawsuit that year. I fired everyone involved in the system failure and shut down the subsidiary. Beyond that, no. Richard managed those operations and I didn't review the details of individual cases. Why? Because Isabel Rivera was my wife, and the 18-minute dispatch delay killed her. Your company's negligence, specifically your ex-husband's cost-cutting measures, are the reason Dylan doesn't have a mother, and I spent 3 years cleaning parking garages instead of doing work that mattered. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus watched emotions flicker across Elena's face. Shock, horror, guilt, and finally a kind of terrible comprehension. She stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Marcus, shoulders rigid with tension. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear. How long have you known that I was connected to what happened? Since the first night I moved in. I found the files while researching your enemies. I saw the settlement records, saw Hartwell Emergency Solutions, saw Isabel's name listed as the deceased party. Elena turned to face him, and Marcus could see tears tracking down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. And you stayed anyway. You protected my daughter, ate at my table, let your son bond with mine, all while knowing that my family's company killed your wife. What, wait, because Sophie didn't kill Isabel. You didn't kill Isabel. Richard's negligence and the dispatch manager's incompetence killed Isabel, along with a software system that was never properly tested because spending an extra 6 months on quality control would have impacted quarterly earnings. I was angry at first, furious actually, but then I got to know you, and you're not the villain I wanted you to be. You're just a person trying to do better after discovering that people you trusted made catastrophic mistakes. Elena crossed the room and sat down heavily in the chair across from Marcus. I should have caught it sooner. I was so focused on the big picture, on expansion and market share, and proving I could run the company as well as my father did, that I delegated operational decisions without sufficient oversight. Richard told me Emergency Solutions was performing within acceptable parameters, and I believed him because it was easier than doing the audit that would have revealed he was prioritizing profit margins over dispatch accuracy. Your wife died because I wasn't paying attention. The admission carried a weight that Marcus recognized, the same guilt he'd been living with for 3 years, the conviction that if he'd just been more careful or more present or more something, Isabel would still be alive. He'd thought hearing Elena accept responsibility would feel like vindication, would somehow balance the scales of justice that had been tilted against him since the moment Isabel stopped breathing. Instead, it just felt two people carrying burdens that couldn't be set down because the dead couldn't come back to absolve anyone. Marcus found himself telling Elena about the morning Isabel died, details he'd never shared with anyone except the therapist Dylan's school had insisted he see. They'd argued the night before about Marcus missing another anniversary dinner because of a training exercise. Isabel had been hurt but understanding, the way she always was, and Marcus had promised to make it up to her later. Later never came. The next morning, Isabel went to work her shift at the emergency room, and on the drive home, her car was struck by a pickup truck whose driver had suffered a heart attack. The impact was severe but not immediately fatal. Isabel was conscious when Marcus arrived, able to tell him she loved him and ask him to take care of Dylan. But the internal hemorrhaging was progressing rapidly, and she needed a trauma team with blood for transfusion. Marcus had called dispatch, had given them the exact location, had emphasized that his wife was a medical professional who could tell them she was dying faster than the field paramedics could treat her. The ambulance was supposed to arrive within 8 minutes based on their proximity to the nearest hospital. 18 minutes later, it finally appeared, having been sent to the wrong intersection because someone had transposed 2 digits in the GPS coordinates, and the backup systems designed to catch that kind of error hadn't been functioning due to the software update Richard had rushed into production. By the time they corrected the mistake and arrived at the actual accident site, Isabel had bled out internally and no amount of emergency intervention could revive her. Marcus's voice had gone flat by the time he finished the story. Emotion leached away by repetition and the protective numbness that was the only way he'd learned to talk about it. I was a rescue specialist. I'd pulled people from collapsed buildings and burning cars and floodwaters. But I couldn't save my own wife from bleeding to death on a sunny Tuesday morning because your husband decided software testing was an unnecessary expense. Elena's response was barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. It's not enough, and it doesn't change anything, but I am so deeply sorry that my negligence and Richard's greed took her from you and Dylan. The apology should have felt hollow or insufficient, but Marcus found it landed differently than the corporate condolences and legal settlements that had followed Isabel's death. Elena wasn't apologizing on behalf of Hartwell MedTech as an institution. She was apologizing as a person who had failed at something important and couldn't undo the consequences. There was a rawness to it that Marcus hadn't expected, a willingness to sit in the discomfort of responsibility without trying to deflect or minimize. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelations settling between them. Finally, Elena spoke again. The job offer stands if you want it, not because I'm trying to buy forgiveness or assuage my guilt, but because you're genuinely the best person for the position, and I think it would give you back some of what you lost when you left rescue work. But I understand if you need to leave, if staying here knowing what you know would be impossible. I won't fight you on it, and I won't make it awkward with Dylan and Sophie. Marcus considered the offer, turning it over in his mind from every angle. Taking the job would mean fully integrating his life with Elena's, would mean building something permanent from what had started as a temporary arrangement. It would mean letting go of the anger he'd been nursing, accepting that the world was more complicated than simple narratives of heroes and villains allowed. It would mean trusting that Elena had learned from her mistakes, that she would do better going forward, that the reforms she'd implemented after Isabel's death were genuine rather than performative. But it would also mean Dylan could attend the private school where he'd finally found friends. It would mean financial security for the first time since Isabel died, would mean doing work that utilized Marcus's skills rather than wasting them on custodial tasks. It would mean belonging somewhere, being part of something larger than just survival. And it would mean, though he was barely willing to admit this even to himself, staying close to Elena, who had become someone whose judgment he valued and whose company he'd come to need in ways that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Before Marcus could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from Detective Chen. He answered on speaker so Elena could hear. Chen's voice carried urgency. "We've arrested the third man from Derek Ashford's crew. He's been singing like a canary trying to reduce his sentence, and he just told us something you both need to hear." Derek wasn't working alone. He had a financial backer, someone who helped fund the operation and provided logistical support. The man claims he doesn't know the backer's identity. All contact was through encrypted messages, but he provided communications that our tech people traced back to a server registered to Hartwell MedTech. Elena's face went pale. "That's impossible. Our servers are protected by multiple layers of security. Nobody outside the executive team has the kind of access needed to set up covert communications." Chen's response was grim, "Which means someone on your executive team was helping Derek Ashford try to murder your daughter, Ms. Hartwell. I'm sending officers to your location now for protection while we investigate, but you need to assume that whoever this is might make a move once they realize we've identified the connection. Stay inside, don't open the door for anyone you don't recognize, and keep your phone with you at all times." The call ended, and Marcus was already moving, pulling his gun from the safe in his room and checking the security feeds on his phone. Everything appeared normal. The front gate was closed, the driveway empty, no alerts from any of the sensors. But if someone from Hartwell's executive team was involved, they would know about the security systems because Elena had reviewed them with her senior staff after the first attack. They would know where the cameras were positioned and where the blind spots existed. They would know Elena's routines, her vulnerabilities, the times when she was most likely to be isolated. Marcus found Elena standing frozen in the study, her face a mask of betrayal. "Someone I work with every day, someone I trusted with confidential information and major decisions, helped fund an attempt to kidnap Sophie. They knew what Derek was planning and they supported it anyway." How is that possible? Marcus had been running scenarios in his head since Chen mentioned the server. 3 executives had the level of access required. The CFO who had replaced Richard, the head of research and development, and the chief operating officer. All 3 had been with the company for over a decade. All 3 had been present at board meetings where Elena's security concerns were discussed. All 3 would have known exactly when and where she was most vulnerable. But only one of them had a clear motive to want Elena removed from power. The COO, Victor Brennan, had been passed over when Elena's father chose her as his successor, despite Victor having more years of experience and stronger relationships with the old guard on the board. He'd stayed with the company afterward, ostensibly accepting the decision with grace, but Marcus had reviewed the personnel files and noticed a pattern of Victor undermining Elena's initiatives through carefully orchestrated delays and resource allocation issues. Nothing overt enough to justify termination, but enough to suggest underlying resentment. Marcus voiced his suspicion and watched Elena's expression shift from shock to a terrible understanding. "Victor. Of course it's Victor. He's been sabotaging acquisitions for months, causing just enough problems that the board questions my judgment without leaving evidence of deliberate obstruction. And he knew about my security protocols because I asked him to coordinate with our facilities management team on implementing them. He would have known exactly how to circumvent the systems he helped design." The realization was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the second floor. Marcus was moving before conscious thought could catch up, taking the stairs 3 at a time with his weapon drawn. He reached the landing in time to see a figure in black tactical gear coming through Dylan's bedroom window, moving with professional efficiency that suggested military or law enforcement training. Marcus fired twice, both shots striking the intruder's body armor and knocking him backward but not penetrating. The man rolled with the impact and came up with his own weapon raised. Marcus dove for cover behind a hallway cabinet as return fire chipped splinters from the wood. He could hear Elena screaming for the children downstairs, could hear Sophie crying and Dylan's voice trying to calm her. Marcus leaned out and fired 3 more rounds, aiming for the intruder's legs where the armor didn't protect. One shot connected and the man went down with a grunt of pain. Marcus closed the distance before he could recover, kicking the weapon away and pressing his own gun to the back of the intruder's head. He kept the man pinned while pulling out his phone to call 911, reporting shots fired and an intruder down. Police were already en route from Chen's call, but Marcus emphasized officer needs assistance to ensure they understood the urgency. Then he grabbed the intruder's radio from his tactical vest and listened to the chatter. There were at least 2 more outside, one covering the back entrance and another disabling the main gate so they could bring in a vehicle for extraction. This wasn't a solo operation. This was a coordinated assault meant to look professional enough that Elena's security team would be blamed for inadequate protection if it succeeded. Marcus zip-tied the intruder's hands using supplies from the emergency kit he'd insisted on keeping in the upstairs hallway. The man was cursing steadily, clutching at his bleeding leg, but Marcus felt no sympathy. This person had been prepared to kidnap or kill a 6-year-old child for money, had willingly participated in an attack orchestrated by someone who should have been protecting Elena instead of conspiring against her. Whatever pain he was experiencing now was a fraction of what he'd been planning to inflict. The police arrived within 6 minutes, which felt like hours. SWAT teams secured the perimeter and arrested the 2 accomplices trying to flee out the back. Detective Chen came through the front door with her weapon drawn, sweeping each room methodically before holstering and turning to Marcus. "Everyone okay?" Marcus nodded toward where Elena sat on the couch with both children pressed against her sides. Shaken but unharmed. The intruder upstairs is zip-tied and needs medical attention for a gunshot wound to the leg. "You'll want to get a warrant for Victor Brennan's arrest immediately." He's the inside man, I'm certain of it. Chen pulled out her phone and made the call while other officers began processing the scene. The intruder Marcus had shot was taken away on a stretcher, still cursing and demanding a lawyer. The forensics team photographed the broken window and recovered shell casings from the hallway. Elena gave her statement in a voice that had gone hollow with shock, describing how she'd heard the breaking glass in Marcus's gunfire and had grabbed the children to hide in the safe room she'd had installed after Derek's first attack. The arrest warrant for Victor Brennan was executed within the hour. Officers found him at his Nob Hill apartment, attempting to wipe data from multiple hard drives. The encryption was sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough to defeat the FBI's digital forensics team. And within 3 hours, they had recovered communications between Victor and Derek Ashford, dating back 6 months. The messages laid out the entire conspiracy. Victor had approached Derek after Catherine's suicide, had offered financial support and inside information in exchange for Derek removing Elena from her position as CEO. The plan had been for Derek's attacks to continue escalating until either Elena was killed or the board lost confidence in her ability to protect the company and forced her resignation. At that point, Victor would step in as interim CEO and gradually consolidate power. Victor had never intended for Sophie to actually be harmed. The attacks were meant to terrorize Elena, to make her appear weak and unstable, to create conditions where removing her seemed like the responsible choice. But Derek's grief had transformed the plan into something more personal and violent, and Victor had continued supporting him even after it became clear that Derek actually intended to murder a child. The communications showed Victor trying to rein in Derek's more extreme plans while simultaneously providing the resources he needed to carry them out. A moral cowardice that sickened Marcus more than straightforward malice would have. Elena listened to Detective Chen's summary of the evidence with a face carved from stone. When Chen finished, Elena asked a single question. "How much did Victor offer to pay Derek for killing me?" Chen hesitated before answering. $500,000 with an additional $1 million if it looked like an accident that couldn't be traced back to either of them. The number hung in the air, simultaneously enormous and inadequate. Elena had worked with Victor Brennan for 12 years. She'd promoted him to COO, had trusted his judgment on major strategic decisions, had considered him a mentor when she first took over as CEO, and he'd valued her life at $1.5 million, less than the annual bonus he would have received once he controlled the company. The betrayal by Victor cut deeper than Richard's embezzlement had. Marcus could see it in the way Elena's hands shook as she poured herself a drink after the police finally left. Richard had been her husband, but their relationship had been built on false pretenses from the start, with Richard viewing Elena as a stepping stone to wealth and power, rather than a genuine partner. Victor's betrayal was different. She'd trusted his professional judgment, had valued his experience and perspective, had believed they shared the same commitment to Hartwell MedTech's mission. Discovering that he'd been undermining her for years while plotting her murder felt like a fundamental break in Elena's ability to trust her own judgment about people. Marcus found her on the back patio hours later, staring at the city lights with the blank expression of someone whose internal world had fundamentally shifted. He sat down without speaking, just offering his presence in case she needed it. After several minutes, Elena finally broke the silence. I built my entire life on the belief that I could control things through preparation and careful planning. I thought if I just worked hard enough, vetted people thoroughly enough, put sufficient security measures in place, I could prevent bad outcomes. But Derek got through the security. Victor betrayed me despite years of working together. Richard stole from me for most of our marriage. At what point do I accept that maybe I'm just terrible at identifying who people really are underneath the faces they show me? Marcus's response came slowly, thinking through the implications as he spoke. You're not terrible at reading people. You're human, which means sometimes you miss things or trust the wrong person or assume good intentions where they don't exist. But you're also willing to examine your mistakes and adapt, which is more than most people manage. You fired everyone involved in Isabel's death and reformed your safety protocols. You accepted responsibility for Derek's wife, even though the chain of causation was indirect. You're sitting here questioning your judgment rather than deflecting blame onto everyone else. That's not failure. That's growth. Elena turned to look at him, tears tracking down her face in the dim patio light. You should hate me. Your wife is dead because I wasn't careful enough. My daughter is alive because you were. How is that fair? The question had no good answer because life wasn't fair, a truth Marcus had learned viscerally when Isabel died. But fairness wasn't the relevant metric anymore. What mattered was what they did with the unfairness, how they chose to move forward despite carrying losses that would never fully heal. Marcus had spent 3 years trapped in anger and grief, and it had accomplished nothing except making him and Dylan both miserable. Elena could spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt about Isabel and Catherine Ashford, or she could accept that she'd made mistakes and commit to doing better going forward. Marcus heard himself saying words he hadn't known he was ready to speak. I don't hate you. I wanted to at first, needed someone to blame for Isabel being gone. But hate is exhausting and it doesn't bring anyone back. You can't change what happened with the dispatch system. I can't change that I wasn't there when Isabel needed me. Derek couldn't change that his wife killed herself. But we can decide whether those losses define us or whether we let them teach us something about what really matters. Lena's voice was barely audible. What does matter? The people still depending on us. Dylan and Sophie, who deserve better than watching the adults in their lives destroy themselves with guilt and grief. Building something meaningful from what's left instead of just surviving. Trusting that even though people fail sometimes, they're also capable of change and growth and becoming better versions of themselves. The words felt almost like a prayer, a statement of faith and possibilities Marcus wasn't entirely sure he believed, but needed to articulate anyway. Elena reached over and took his hand, the gesture tentative but carrying a weight that suggested she was choosing to trust, despite every instinct telling her that trust led to betrayal. They sat like that until dawn broke over the bay, two people who had lost too much finding their way towards something that might eventually resemble hope. The Isabel Rivera Memorial Fund was Elena's idea, proposed 3 weeks after Victor Brennan's arrest, when life had begun to settle into a new normal. She called Marcus into her office and presented the concept with the careful formality of someone pitching a business proposal rather than making amends. $10 million in endowment funding dedicated to improving emergency response systems and providing training for first responders. Technology grants to prevent the kind of dispatch failures that had killed Isabel. Scholarships for children of emergency workers, with Dylan Rivera listed as the inaugural recipient. Marcus stared at the presentation slides, his throat tightening until he couldn't speak. Elena continued filling the silence. It won't bring her back, and it doesn't absolve me of responsibility for what happened. But it ensures that Isabel's death means something beyond grief and loss. It turns tragedy into a legacy that prevents future tragedies. And it publicly acknowledges what Hartwell MedTech failed to do, which is value human life over quarterly profits. When Marcus finally found words, they came out rough with emotion. You're naming it after her. Elena nodded. She deserves to be remembered, not just as a statistic in a wrongful death settlement, but as a person whose life had value and whose death should have consequences beyond monetary payouts. This fund is my acknowledgement that the Hartwell family failed Isabel Rivera, and my commitment to ensuring we never fail anyone the same way again. Marcus accepted, and 3 months later, they held the fund's inaugural ceremony at a community center in the Mission District. First responders from across California attended, along with Isabel's former colleagues from the emergency room where she'd worked. Dylan gave a brief speech about his mother, his voice steady despite the tears on his face, and Marcus stood beside his son, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Isabel's funeral. A sense that her death hadn't been meaningless, that the pain had transformed into something that might prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. Sophie and Dylan had become inseparable by then, the kind of siblings who weren't related by blood, but had chosen each other through the shared experience of absent parents and lives upended by circumstances beyond their control. Sophie no longer had nightmares about bad men coming through her window. Dylan smiled more readily and talked about his mother without the crushing weight of grief that had defined him for 3 years. They walked to school together each morning, Dylan carrying Sophie's backpack and Sophie chattering about whatever book she was currently obsessed with, and Marcus watched them from the kitchen window, feeling grateful in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Elena had offered Marcus the director of security position again after Victor's arrest, and this time he'd accepted. The work was challenging in ways that satisfied the part of him that had missed tactical planning and threat assessment. He rebuilt Hartwell MedTech's security protocols from the ground up, implementing lessons learned from both his rescue operations experience and the recent attacks. He trained staff in recognizing pre-incident indicators, established redundant communication systems that couldn't be compromised by a single corrupted executive, created response plans for scenarios ranging from active shooters to cyber attacks to natural disasters. But the work was balanced by evenings spent at Elena's house, which had gradually transformed from temporary shelter into something closer to home. Mrs. Chen cooked dinner for all of them most nights, and they'd fallen into routines that felt comfortable rather than forced. Dylan helped Sophie with homework. Marcus taught both children basic self-defense techniques that were practical rather than theatrical. Elena had started leaving work earlier, prioritizing time with Sophie over the endless meetings that had previously consumed her life. And Marcus had found himself noticing things about Elena that had nothing to do with security protocols or shared trauma. The way she laughed at Dylan's terrible jokes. The fierce concentration on her face when she was solving a complex problem. The gentleness in her voice when she read bedtime stories to Sophie. The gradual softening of the walls she'd built after Richard's betrayal, replaced by a willingness to be vulnerable that Marcus recognized because he'd undergone the same transformation. They never discussed what they were becoming to each other, whether this was friendship or something more complicated. The boundaries between living together for practical reasons and living together for emotional ones had blurred until Marcus couldn't identify where one ended and the other began. He knew Dylan was happy, genuinely happy, in ways that had nothing to do with guilt or obligation. He knew Sophie adored Dylan and treated Marcus with the casual affection of a child who'd accepted him as a permanent fixture in her life. And he knew that when he imagined leaving, when he considered finding his own apartment and creating space between himself and Elena, the thought felt wrong in ways that suggested his feelings had evolved beyond professional respect. 6 months after Derek Ashford's death, Elena found Marcus in the garden, where he'd been teaching Dylan and Sophie about the constellations visible in San Francisco's light-polluted sky. She waited until the children ran inside to get snacks before sitting down beside him on the bench. "I need to tell you something, and I don't know how you'll take it." Marcus's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety, expecting her to say this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely, that she needed space or Dylan needed his own father's attention rather than the shared family structure they'd built. Instead, Elena reached over and took his hand. "I'm falling in love with you. Or maybe I already have fallen, and I'm just now admitting it. I know it's complicated, given everything between us, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed to say it because I'm tired of hiding from things that scare me." Marcus sat very still, processing words he'd been afraid to hope for because wanting them felt like betraying Isabel's memory. But Isabel was gone, and Dylan was here, and Sophie was here, and Elena was here, offering something Marcus had thought he'd lost the right to when his wife died on a sunny Tuesday morning 3 years ago. The capacity to love someone new, to build a life that honored the past without being trapped by it, to accept that grief and hope could coexist in the same heart. His response came quietly but without hesitation. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since you tackled that attacker in the parking garage to protect Sophie, and I've been terrified of admitting it because it felt like choosing you meant forgetting Isabel. But I'm learning that's not how it works. Loving you doesn't diminish what I had with Isabel. It just means I'm choosing to keep living instead of just surviving." They sat together in the garden until Dylan and Sophie came back out with cookies and juice boxes, and when the children curled up on either side of them to look at stars, it felt like a family in all the ways that mattered most. Not perfect or without complications, but real and chosen and built from the wreckage of individual tragedies into something that might eventually resemble wholeness.